Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. So today I wanted to share with you a couple of observations on the subject of safety. A couple of interesting trends that I've identified. Now, to put this in context, if you work for just about any major corporation here in the U.S., they'll probably have some kind of corporate safety training program. Whether that training program is indigenous to the company itself, or whether that's a function that they contract out, or something in between. Maybe they buy a curriculum and their trainers use that. But anyway, they'll probably have some kind of safety training program. And at least from what I've seen, most of these programs tend to all be kind of the same, or follow the same basic precepts. A lot of them like to start off with the assertion that all accidents are preventable. And then they will go on to explain what they think are the key causes of accidents and how you can eliminate those causes. But in so doing, it seems like they tend to focus exclusively on immediate physical hazards and or the individual's awareness of those hazards. If you boil down their philosophical underpinnings, it seems like most of these programs fundamentally believe that if someone gets hurt, it's because that individual either was not aware of the hazards that they were exposing themselves to, or perhaps was aware of those hazards but did not take adequate actions to mitigate those hazards. And so in either case, it was really the individual's own fault that they got hurt, and therefore the company shouldn't be held liable, and corporate liability is probably the basic reason that most of these programs exist, so that's really what they were driving at all along. I can't say as I've really gotten a lot of useful hazard avoidance training as an employee in these various programs. Seems like a lot of the training I've gotten under the guise of all-hands corporate safety training was probably less useful than someone just saying, hey, use a little common sense and don't get hurt today. But in conjunction with their safety training programs, a lot of these companies will also try to encourage employee discussion of accidents and close calls for the purpose of identifying lessons learned and promoting a positive safety culture. And so, I've heard a lot of informal case studies, well, formal and informal case studies of, people getting injured at work or at home. One company that I worked for, would start off practically every meeting with what they called a safety share, where someone would tell a story about either how they got injured or how someone they knew got injured, or how they had a close call, and we would discuss it as sort of an informal case study. And after a few years, I got to the point where, as I heard the first few sentences of a safety share, I could guess with almost 100% accuracy how it was going to turn out, at least in a general sense. Because it seemed like the vast majority of these informal case studies fell into one of two categories. The first category would be what I would call people who got lucky. These are the stories that start off explaining how the individual in question was doing something blatantly unsafe. Maybe they just didn't know what they were doing and were completely oblivious to the hazard. More often than not, they were fully aware of the hazards, and yet for whatever reason, they failed to take responsible mitigating actions. This is the construction worker who doesn't have a tall enough ladder, and so, he sets up a step ladder over here and a step ladder over here, puts an old plank across the top between the two, puts a third step ladder up on the plank, and then he's climbing, 2/3 of the way up the second step ladder, carrying a 4x8 sheet of plywood or drywall or what have you, when a gust of wind catches the plywood, blows him off the ladder, and after surviving a 30-foot fall with only minor scrapes and bruises, he dusts himself off and says, "Whew, that was close, I shouldn't have done that." And maybe that's a little bit of an exaggerated example, but that illustrates the basic character of this class of case studies. These were the people who got lucky. The people who were doing something blatantly unsafe and yet got off with either just a close call or a relatively minor injury. Something that they can look back on and say, that could have been a whole lot worse than it was. The second category is, for lack of a better term, what we might call people who got unlucky. And these are the stories of people who managed to sustain serious injuries without ever really doing anything that could reasonably be considered unsafe. A lot of these stories involved some kind of athletic recreation. It seems like one of the most recent ones I heard, the person in question was playing basketball just recreationally with some other people at an indoor gymnasium. He was wearing appropriate, clothing and gear and wasn't particularly pushing himself or doing anything that might push himself beyond his limits. But somehow he jumped up in the air and landed in just the wrong angle on his foot and sustained an injury that required something like 3 surgeries and 8 months of collective recuperation time. And again, he was a very safety-conscious individual. He had all the right gear, was taking all the right precautions, and yet he sustained a serious injury. And so again, this is illustrative of that class of examples, of case studies. And like I said, the substantial majority of the examples and case studies that I heard over the years fit into one of those two categories. Either people who got lucky, people who were doing something that was clearly substantially unsafe and yet didn't get injured all that seriously, or people who got unlucky, people who were basically doing everything right and yet somehow managed to sustain a pretty serious injury. And this kind of runs contrary to the model that a lot of these safety programs would present, because their model is basically that people get injured either because they're not adequately aware of the hazards or because they didn't take adequate mitigating actions to protect themselves from those hazards. And so the model would predict that people who are more safety conscious, people who are more aware of the hazards that they are exposing themselves to and more proactive in mitigating those hazards would sustain fewer and less severe injuries. Now, I realize that in some sense our data set based on these examples and case studies is incomplete because we don't have any data points for the people who were safety conscious and didn't get hurt. If they didn't get hurt or didn't have a close call, then they wouldn't have a story to share as a case study. Likewise, perhaps you could argue that the people who were doing something blatantly unsafe and didn't get lucky might not be around to share the story anymore. But given that a lot of these stories weren't necessarily shared by the person who experienced it, a lot of them were, but a lot of them also were, what happened to so-and-so or what they read about in the newspaper or something like that. I think we still would have gotten most of those data points. So, I don't think we have necessarily enough data to say that all the data is contrary to the model. What we do have enough data to say is that there's something missing from the model. It doesn't explain all the data because there's these counterexamples of people who were doing blatantly unsafe things and didn't get hurt all that bad, and perhaps more importantly, people who were doing things that were pretty safe and got injured pretty seriously. And to put it bluntly, I think the element that is missing from our safety model is God. When God created this universe, he ordained that it should operate in accordance with understandable physical principles, the laws of physics. When he created man, he gave him a measure of free agency. Man has the ability to make decisions and to bear the consequences of his decisions. So, when a man disregards the laws of physics, it's easy for him to get himself hurt. And yet, God is still sovereign over this universe, and God is remarkably merciful. And that, I think, is the explanation for our case studies of the people who got lucky, or rather, our explanation for why so many people seemed to get lucky. So many people, yes, bore the consequences of their, not so intelligent or not so responsible actions, but those consequences were tempered with a great deal of mercy. So too, with regards to the people who got unlucky, the people who experienced injury or illness or other physical hardship through no fault of their own, at least as far as the immediate physical hazards were concerned, it stands to reason that God must have allowed this event in their life to bring about some higher purpose. Now, in a lot of these, case studies and informal examples, the discussion was limited to the immediate physical circumstances surrounding the event. And so, in many of these cases, we don't have nearly enough information to pin down what that higher purpose might have been. In some cases, we may not understand what that higher purpose was this side of eternity. But we can speculate that in some cases, maybe God needed to get their attention. Maybe they needed some time recuperating in a hospital bed to, consider their ways and bring about positive changes in other areas of their life. Perhaps they just needed to go through that in order to learn something. Perhaps the hardship was worth it for God to teach them some important spiritual truth. And there have been many great volumes of theology written on the subject of why God allows hardship in the lives of people, which I do not intend to recapitulate in this short episode. So I think that suffices to present my basic observations on these trends in safety. Until next time, thank you for watching the Idahoan Show.